thank you to those joining us live and to those listening afterwards. I'd also like to warmly welcome our guests today, whom, as you can see, will be Dr. Betty Chaar, Associate Professor at the University of Sydney, Australia, Dr. Sanya Ram, Senior Lecturer at the University of Auckland, New Zealand, Dr. Cicely Roche, Associate Professor in Practice of Pharmacy, Trinity College, Dublin, Ireland. And we'll also have Dr. Jessica Pace, Associate Lecturer in the Sydney Pharmacy School, who will be facilitating the discussion. So my name is Maria Allinson, and I am Head of Pharmacy Practice in the University of Sheffield in the UK. And I'm also a member of the FIP Ethics Advisory Group. So today, we're delighted to be welcoming you to this webinar. The webinar is being recorded live and live streamed via YouTube, and the recording will be available on our website afterwards. You may ask questions using the question box provided, so it's great that everybody is posting in the chat. But if you have any specific questions that you would like any of the panel to answer, please put them in the Q&A box so it's easier for us to find them. You're welcome to provide feedback. We're always happy to give feedback so we can improve our webinars. And obviously, if you would like to become a member of FIP, the link is there for registration. Please do so. So, as I have already introduced the panelists, you know who they are. Dr. Betty Chaar will be talking first about the ethical implications for the profession of this Oxempic pandemic that we seem to be facing. And she will be talking about it from the perspective mainly of the Australian experience. Dr. Cicely Roche will then move on to look at ethical challenges. So she will focus on rationing, looking at pressure to supply, and using unlicensed medicines. And finally, Sanya Ram, Dr. Ram, will talk about off-label prescribing, compounding, and patient safety. And she will look at it from a legal perspective. Following this, we will have a panel discussion where we will also be joined by Didier Mouliam. We're very pleased to be able to welcome him. He's Vice President of the FIP Industrial Pharmacy section, so it's great that he can join us. And there will be a final wrap-up and conclusion. So the event objectives today are to explore the ethical implications and moral responsibilities of the pharmacist relating to medicine shortages, off-label prescribing, and compounding. So I'll introduce you first to my dear friend, Dr. Betty Chaar. Dr. Betty Chaar is an associate professor and researcher in pharmacy practice at the University of Sydney School of Pharmacy. She's a fellow of the International Pharmaceutical Federation, and she is chair of the Ethics Advisory Group. So Betty will be talking about the ethical implications of the Oxempic pandemic for the profession. So over to you, Betty.
Thank you, Maria. Good evening from Australia. Thank you, Maria, for your lovely introduction. And I'm going to go straight into my presentation about the Oxempic pandemic from the perspective of our experience here in Australia. And I'm sure you will find it is almost global. It is phenomenal, actually. So let me just remind everyone that when we make decisions in pharmacy, we rely on 4 pillars of bioethics, which are respect for patient autonomy, for patient dignity, their own needs, their own decision-making, their own autonomy, justice, equity in access, in particular regarding today's talk, to do no harm, non-maleficence, and to do good. These are the 4 pillars that we rely on for our ethical practice. But we also have to think about conducting our business as community pharmacists. And we have to consider conflicts of interests, whether perceived or real. We have to think about the impact of what we call DTCA, which is direct to consumer advertising. How does it affect our clients? How does it affect the needs that it creates? And it's a very powerful tool. We have to think about duality of interest, because if you think about it, every person, every healthcare provider has duality of interest, whether it's a pharmacist or a doctor or an anesthetist, or that we all have to keep the business viable. We have to make a living. So we ask ourselves, and we must always remember, can the balance of this duality of interests versus the best interests of the patient and the respect for their autonomy, is it achievable? Is it sustainable? We hold that question whilst we dig further. And what about our responsibility for social accountability? What about our reason for being as pharmacists and our patient-centered care? So today I present you with a case study about Ozempic. I think everyone knows about it, but semaglutide was introduced in the US in December of 2017. By 2022, we realized that one of the side effects of Ozempic, which was introduced for diabetes and cardiovascular disease, was weight loss. Strong, substantial weight loss. And that became a trigger. So by 2023, there was so much advertising for this side effect, for this effect on the human being, on the human body, that people lost 15% of their weight in 1 year, or whatever the ads were telling us. Became a pandemic in and of itself. So we looked at thousands and thousands of ads. Consumers were telling us that they were seeing the ads for weight loss injections everywhere they looked, on TV, on public transport, on airports' walls. Pretty much every surface that could be advertised on was used to market Ozempic, only in its side effect for weight loss. Have a look at this DTCA, direct-to-consumer advertising. Tell me, am I seeing things, or do you also notice that these are different people? These are different people, but they've got them there, and they captured the idea of weight loss. Before, after, before, after. Doesn't tell you who or when or what or anything, but it worked. They got so much advertising, even when the shortages became quite noticeable, and it became very strong that you couldn't get it, even if you wanted it, even if you were persuaded by the ads, you couldn't get it for the shortages. There was so much competition to get it, whether it was for diabetes or some other obesity-related kind of condition, or for weight loss itself. Everyone was clamoring for it. People were desperate for it. And look at this, click here for a free online consultation. They really didn't need to advertise any longer. You don't need all these ads at all. But free consultations, $7 a day, really cheap, weight loss, don't have to do anything, don't have to go on a diet. You just inject yourself once a week with 1 milligram and you're done. So not only did they do that, there's lots of photoshopping, as you can see here. This is in 1 month, this is in 6 months. Imagine, this is a huge magnifying glass, and I don't think it's realistic in 6 months whatsoever. Even if it does cause weight loss, not in 6 months. And this is photoshopping. So all the advertisements and all the celebrities. Here's Oprah. Here's the before and after. I don't know which before and which after. It just catches your eye. And this one is called Jelly Roll, apparently. I'm not sure what that means, but these are popular people and these are powerful people. Oprah, as everyone would know, is a very powerful advertisement. And if it worked for her, it could work for anyone, I guess. So the implications of this rush for Ozempic is multifactorial. It was introduced for cardiovascular disease and diabetes. It's gone off now. It's off-label prescribing. Very successful off-label prescribing. The influx, actually the tsunami of the demand, the ads were all over the world. I'm not just talking Australia here, I am talking everywhere. Of course, all those ads were US-based. These caused shortages, and not for the raw material, but for the gadget. So the injection itself, the syringe, was specifically gauged to give the 1 milligram in certain clicks. And it was an interesting introduction, but they couldn't cope with the production. So there were people who started to take advantage of the vulnerability because patients or consumers became vulnerable. They started to be desperate. And we saw some pharmacies genuinely or genuinely manufacture injectables. Now, we all know that manufacturing is part of our job. We know how to manufacture, we know how to compound medicines, but they're usually creams, powders, liquids. We very rarely have the capability in a community pharmacy to manufacture injectables, but people were. In Australia, they did. They made injectables. I'll show you in a minute. Of semaglutide. Then the challenges became very, very clear. First of all, for pharmacy, it was the challenge of managing the consumer or the patient's expectations. It was difficult to say, well, we don't have the product. Or I saw some pharmacists saying, what are you using it for? And they had to ration. They had to make a decision who to give it to. This is very, very damaging. It was very damaging. And it was risky for the profession, for the manufacturers even, for the business. Had it not been for the desperation of people wanting this product, I think pharmacy would have sunk really low. But for the grace of the Lord Almighty, we're still functioning. However, in Australia, there was a documentary that was collected, and it was scathing. To a point where lately we have new GLP-1 agonists, semaglutide, the same product, different name. They've come to Australia, but this time they didn't advertise, they didn't market or even seek approval for cardiovascular and diabetes. No, they don't need to. All they wanted was to have semaglutide injectable on the table, ready for consumption, but at 4 to 5 times the cost of the Ozempic, the exact same product. Now, in Australia, we have two things that are a little bit specific, but I'll explain them. For example, TGA is the Therapeutic Goods Administration. You have to register a medicine before even seeking anything else in Australia. So they sought for the Wegovy product, which is exactly the same as Ozempic, but at 4 times the price. They sought registration, but they did not seek Pharmaceutical Benefits Scheme approval, which means the consumer, the ordinary citizen, would get it at a subsidized cost. At the moment, if you want a month's supply, Wegovy or anything similar is about $500, if not more, a month in Australia, which is huge. Some people are ready to, are prepared to pay it, others can't. But there's even a darker side. And this is what the vial looked like, the Ozempic underground. This was uncovered by the ABC Four Corners documentary, and it was a chilling recall of what was happening. So this is what they used, the old-fashioned little syringes, not the clicking one. They faxed every single doctor they could get their hands on details of and sent them the ads. When the Four Corners were trying to track them down, they found that they called themselves Global Compounding Pharmaceutics at that time. It was an empty warehouse. There were wheels and tires there. No, nothing. We still, to this day, not sure where these products were being made. The orders arrived in the mail, so from Australia to the US in this form, wet, hot, unusable. These are the packs that they came in. It was just awful. Soon, they were tracked down, not only by Four Corners, but also by Scam Pulse. And here are some comments. They list an address on their website, making it look like their company is from Wyoming, but it's not. They're really located in Australia. And we couldn't even find where they were. Just be advised, this is not a company in the US, probably not regulated. I received a product from Australia. It was hot and unusable. I lost $800. And then they announced Total Compounding Pharmaceuticals. They changed their name a bit. Is a total scam. What happened? After the documentary aired and people started realizing what's going on, we lost a lot of trust. I got interviewed on a radio program, and they only had one question for me. How can we trust pharmacists? Very difficult interview, I can tell you. And we lost loyalty. For a moment, for a little bit of a while, I think the profession suffered reputational loss, and we really did pay a fairly high price for those not even involved in Ozempic or anything else, but still it was there. So my role today is to think about what are our ethical responsibilities. I was thinking about it. If I was working in a community pharmacy and someone asked me for Ozempic, should I tell them not to use it? Good luck with that. People were desperate. Should I not supply? Yes, I could do that. It's legal, but it's not ethical. Should I refuse to supply just because it's off-label? Say, I got to know that it's for weight loss. And it's very demeaning to ask the patient, what are you using this for? Someone told a pharmacist, none of your business. It can happen. So doctors have the legal right to prescribe off-label. Do we have the legal right to refuse? Or should we leave it in the all too hard basket? But I couldn't help thinking, what about our reason for being? What about our social mandate to provide patient-centered care? Should we leave it with my friend here, my friend the gorilla? What to do, what to do? One way going both ways? Or should we focus on the patient? What would you do? Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much for that, Betty. You ask a lot of challenging questions there that we should be thinking about. Moving on now to Dr. Cicely Roche. So Cicely is from Ireland, and she is an associate professor in practice of pharmacy and also Trinity College Dublin Fellow in Education for Sustainable Development. Cicely's key interests are in the areas of ethics and professional reasoning, higher education curriculum design, and program-focused approaches to assessment. Cicely will talk about off-label medicine supply, pressure to supply, and rationing. Thanks, Cicely.
Thanks very much. I'm assuming you can all hear me, and I'm very pleased to join the webinar today to talk about off-label medicines, pressure to supply and rationing, yes, but with the added viewpoint of the practitioner perspective. So in that context, the context is, of course, medicine shortage in pharmacy practice. At the counter when I work on a Saturday, what types of things are challenging me, particularly in context of Oxempic pandemic? I would hope that by the end of this part of the webinar, we'd all be able to talk at some extent of ethical principles related to the rationing of medicines and impacts when pharmacists are pressurized to choose amongst patients, where I have only on a Saturday perhaps 6 Ozempic in the fridge and know that I'm probably likely to be approached by more than 6 patients during that day. And the particular complexities arising with fluctuating demand, as opposed to just not having any stock in stock at all. And finally, a single slide, perhaps, to encourage us to think about this concept of obesity bias and think about ways to protect ourselves as professionals from succumbing to that unknowingly. So in preparing for this, as always, found comfort that the FIP statement of policy on medicines shortages resonated even when I took this viewpoint of the practitioner as to how globally, as adopted in 2020, perhaps tackle medicines shortages and stockouts might be best approached. So the 6 key points, that notion that there'd be a publicly accessible means of gaining information on medicine shortages. And even as a practitioner, that's sometimes complex to access that information in a timely fashion at the practitioner interface. The notion that globally there would be a list of critical or vulnerable products. So that, of course, that might then generate active procurement processes. Dare I mention the notion that there needs to be a little bit of a buffer stock potentially where we've a particularly critical product that we don't want patients without for a period of time unexpectedly. Also, that notion that perhaps more collaboration amongst the regulators, and I'll give you a particular example where things don't align, even for me, between that EU perspective and a local Irish context, which is probably representative of most of us. The notion that there could be a more opportune way of gathering and sharing information about demand, perhaps not just to be the victim of what social media is doing to the patients before I even get an opportunity to interact with them, to use that same technology to help us predict that demand has suddenly increased and perhaps preemptively mitigate against the negative impacts of that. And that FIP adopted policy in 2020 built on the 2013 conference. And I extract here that the reminder from that report that the issue under investigation, that is the timely and affordable availability of medicines, has an impact on health status, human quality of life, and mortality. That's why it's important. Let's not forget that. It's not just moaning about product not being available at one particular point in time or manipulation of the market. There are real impacts. And I also take this alternate options for substitution of medicines are fraught with risk. And much of that risk happens as you're trying to decision make in that community pharmacy situation, where, of course, this notion of inequity of efficacy potentially arises when I simply don't have the same level of information and, of course, lack of availability. And the report nicely summarizes reasons into industry capacity, legislative frameworks, marketing policies, and fluctuating demands. And that notion of just trying to kind of summarize some of the thought processes that go through head from the common ethical challenges arising and what I'm going to call upstream policy, where we could, if you like, advocate for changes that would reduce the negative impacts at the point of patient supply and patient care. So shortages, we know shortages in supply can happen from something as apparently remote as a container ship getting stuck in the Panama Canal. But we're going to accept that those are sort of in a separate lane. But when industry capacity is curtailed, there are decisions made by companies on the production line as to which labeling will be put on the particular product being prepared, and that can have major implications as to which market it's going to go to. And when it gets to market, wholesalers in that market, regardless of where you are in the world, potentially have the authority or feasibility to direct to some supply routes and not others. So there is this whole ethical challenge around prioritization when there are scarce supplies. And for all sorts of reasons, we probably all derive from an expectation we will try to enable and assure fair allocation of medicines, and fair allocation, particularly where some medicines become scarce through a problem with continuity of supply. Legislative frameworks and regulators of health medicines and products in our country, it's the Health Products Regulatory Authority, they're my partner when I'm working as a pharmacist at the counter. When I take the product from the chef and I'm satisfied it's been evaluated for quality, safety, and efficacy, that's of value to me that I can concentrate on counseling the patient. But of course, when the licensed version becomes unavailable, could we upstream have a way of much more rapidly, if you were guiding practitioners towards an unlicensed version, perhaps in the truest sense of the word, but that has some more data to it to support our decision making. Betty has talked about the marketing policy of direct-to-consumer advertising and the social media issues, and our traditional response has been restricting advertising on the basis of, for example, best interest principle, and that doesn't apply anymore because social media is well beyond any restrictions that regulators might be able to impose. And fluctuating demand, I think that notion that if we have stock shortages, it's almost like we're all in this together. And it's different to when I approach a patient in December and say, okay, look, there's shortages. We don't know when it's going to be available again. We're trying to share and get through this so that everybody at least has some. And then the product comes back in a few months later, and then 3 months later, it's gone again. There is this deterioration of the underpinning trust in the profession at risk in that situation. And we'll talk a little bit about rationing on the basis of diagnosis or cost or any other in that regard. Don't need to go through this in detail, rather to remind us that when we have a regulator of medicines and the comfort that gives me as a pharmacist in being able to confidently counsel patients, the regulator assigns a license on the basis of defined conditions, defined indications, defined patient characteristics, the clinical trials, etc., on the basis of the dose trialed. And what we've seen with Ozempic is almost a challenging of some of those principles too, because new product names were assigned for the weight loss issue, and perhaps could have gone unnoticed to many practitioners, to many of the public, that the doses were quite different. And secondly, if I envisage my patient who's struggling on a BMI of 30 or 35, using the medication for an indicated purpose, and how is that different to the patient that perhaps has a BMI of under 25, and I'm looking at them with a valid prescription for a much higher dose of the same ingredient than that which was evaluated by my regulator. So you get the idea. So I put in some of the other terms on this slide because for many jurisdictions we to talk specifically about the unlicensed use as a licensed medicine as being the equivalent of what many countries refer to as off-label use. And an unlicensed use of a licensed medicine in my head is that somewhere a regulatory body that I have trust and faith in has licensed the medicine is different to medicine that hasn't been licensed in any such jurisdiction at all. And the mention then of the European Commission, yes, we do have a centralised medicines approval process, much more streamlined from a manufacturer's point of view, a single market authorisation, all languages translated, a key thing, of course, being centralised safety monitoring. But the sting in the tail is if the local HPRA, our local regulator, has approved that medicine, then I must go by the restrictions in that circumstance. It's only where I don't have that local comfort of the regulator's vision that I may move to using European Commission centralised medicines approval. So now a couple of minutes just on the underpinning ethical principles, and let's tease them a little bit in the language around them. So if my guiding star is that resource allocation will be in an ethically defensible manner, then the question of distributive justice is the terminology we're probably familiar with, the fair, equitable and appropriate distribution of resources in society, and that notion that when resources are limited, rationing being the term, rationing must take place. And of course, justice as a healthcare principle in many jurisdictions and debates, it's around rights-based justice and the corresponding injustice that if we deny people access to benefits to which they've a right or which others in their society have access to, that's injustice. So the expectation in societies is that in this case, patients in similar situations will normally have access to the same healthcare. And if they don't, the people will rise up and say, well, what's going on here? So the key question really is, how do we identify a basis for rationing available resources, whether they're scarce or they're in enormous supply, that will meet a society's criteria to define them as fair? And usually in healthcare discussions or ethics discussions, we talk about three principles. The need principle, where the patient with the greatest need is accommodated first, and that patient's capacity to benefit from a particular healthcare intervention, whether it's Ozempic or it's a respirator in an accident and emergency, is deemed to be the greater. And of course, the classic teaching discombobulating scenario is two patients arrive in, they're both 30 years of age and they both need the single respirator. How are you going to decide? Do you flip a coin? So what if those two patients, one is 30 and the other is 65? Like it or not, our decision is likely to be more straightforward on the basis that the 30-year-old might have an extra 35 years of benefit to gain from the intervention with the respirator. And I'm on the wrong side of that calculation. So I do use it as an example from the heart. The maximizing principle that resources are distributed in such a manner as to achieve the greatest good for all of the population. So might those policymakers pushing to restrict use of Ozempic during that time frame to those diagnosed with diabetes might have been thinking about this side of it. If you need far more of the active ingredient for a weight loss program, that could have been part of a balancing debate. And of course, the concept of evidence-based practice as a tool comes in there too. And did we have the evidence in that regard for the ingredient in Ozempic that had been prepared as the product was going through the approval process? And of course, the egalitarian principle that we have equity. And what does equity mean? And the line sometimes used there, that the most equitable system would be to allocate an equivalent share of resources to each person. When I'm born, I get a share of resources that happen to be born with type 1 diabetes. I'll probably have used up my bank account by the time I'm in my 20s. So there's nothing easy about any of this. And the other concept is this notion of pharmacists as gatekeepers and the requirement that we refused access and continue to refuse access to patients who have valid prescriptions for Ozempic if we're short in supply and we're trying to spare resources for those we've prioritized. We'll have a future need, even if it's only next week or the week after. So that notion comes from society restricting access on their perceived potential to do good or harm. And that we meet this dilemma regularly, but we are in a position of gatekeeper, and therefore we are in a position of power in relation to the patient presenting a prescription. And like it or not, if that patient happens to be the one to whom we say, no, I can't supply you with that, even though if they strained their neck, they'd see a few of my 6 Ozempic injections in the fridge, in the dispensary. So healthcare systems seek to balance priorities, and yes, they impact on the practitioner. I'm not saying I disagree at all with our health services executive approach, that they used reimbursement as a tool to curtail demand or to manage demand and to manage supply by sending out a circular to suggest that while the resources were scarce, we should prioritize those with diabetes. And in principle, at a high level, you can live with that. In practice, it really caused a bit of soul searching here and there. Because it wasn't just about people with type 1 diabetics, it was about those who were registered on the national system. So they were previously diagnosed. They had chosen to take the route where they wouldn't have to pay for the medication, i.e. get a long-term illness number that we talk about. There is no requirement in my practice area for a prescription to contain the indication for which a medicine is prescribed. So I'm in a little bit of a gray zone there. And finally, that notion that I have come across patients who choose not to register on this system and pay for their medication themselves. So even what was probably derived as a national system and a way of managing a sort of fluctuating demand that had hit us fairly suddenly and relatively unexpectedly, it created some challenges for me at the counter, where in some cases I found it of support and helped managing what might have been a complex situation. In others, I found myself challenged by it and having to exercise my professional judgment in the decision to whether a given individual patient might merit supply or not. And finally, just to leave you with this slide, I know we're going to circulate the slides afterwards, to just make sure we touch the stone for each of us individually around bias and prejudice. And the title of this dehumanization of people with obesity is on the increase by Dr. Maurice Houston, a medical colleague who writes in our national paper. And while it's 2019, when I look at it, it really has come to mind so regularly over the last months, and how the Ozempic situation, by going into the examples Betty has given us and media personalities and everything around it being slim and image rather than healthcare, has it added to the notion of fat shaming, fat stigmatization, and fat bias yet again for those who are overweight when obesity becomes more prevalent? Has it in some situations added to this accusation of people of causing their own conditions, rather than obesity being having an underpinning of complex issues? The notion that we have prejudices seems to be reinforced by the studies that Murray Houston refers to here, and the reinforcement that obesity is a complex problem driven by poverty and with significant genetic, psychological, and environmental components, and that we as professionals trying to bring that balance back into the national debate at the time when the acute shortage has really caused problems for people who are already stabilized using Ozempic. And the final couple of paragraphs is quite sobering, that some additional studies suggest that both as academics and practitioners, we're not immune to fat stigmatization either. So it is an issue that not just health professionals, but society as a whole must respond to. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Cicely, for that really informative presentation that you gave there. Again, lots of food for thought. And our final speaker now is Dr. Sanya Ram. Sanya is a pharmacist and a lawyer both, and she's a senior lecturer at the School of Pharmacy, the University of Auckland, New Zealand. She's an emerging researcher at the intersection of pharmacy practice and law, exploring the legal determinants of health and the impact of regulations on practice. And today, Sanya will address drug shortages, off-label prescribing, and patient needs, all from a legal perspective. So over to you, Sanya.
Kia ora koutou katoa. Warm good morning from New Zealand. We're just past midnight, so it's lovely to get the opportunity to speak to you. And Cicely and Betty have covered some of the issues that the shortages of these medicines has presented. And what I look at is globally, what has been the regulatory response to try and look at managing the demand, especially in the off-label prescribing, and look at some of the similarities and the differences of how each of the regulatory authorities have tried to address some of these issues. As has been stated, it is complex given the social media and the importations of medicines, the boundaries between jurisdictions, and as Betty highlighted with the advertising of it. You know, with one quick like and a share, it is all over the world. It doesn't matter whether the jurisdiction or that country's laws has been complied with, and that puts quite a strain on how some of these regulations can actually be enforced. So I'll start off at looking at how regulators have tried to curb the demand, and as Cicely covered, we'll look at you know, trying to ensure that you've got access that's available to those that need it the most. So ensuring that access to diabetic patients that are prescribed it take priority, and each country has tried to in some way prioritize supply to those that they've deemed need it the most in that respect. So some countries have put in requirements in terms of not initiating it to new patients, only providing it to those that are stabilized on the medicine, and then not prioritizing the off-label prescribing. And it's quite interesting. No one has actually regulated off-label prescribing. They've all steered away from that, and then putting that pressure, as Cicely said, on the pharmacist to try and decipher which of these supply to the patient fits within what the guidelines, the prescribing guidelines have been. And so in trying to look at it from a regulator's perspective, where the risk and the benefit lies in trying to actually make sure that you're maximizing the benefit and minimizing harm, the approved medicine for an unapproved indication sits at the lower end of that risk. The higher end of that risk is your unapproved medicine for experimental use. And so when you look at it from a regulator's perspective, actually trying to curb off-label prescribing then becomes quite difficult. And so many of the regulatory bodies have said that they can't actually stop the prescribing of off-label, trying to stop off-label prescribing because they don't have the power to regulate the clinical decisions of health professionals and is unable to actually prevent prescribers from using their clinical judgment to prescribe medicines for other health conditions. So then the only prescribing guidelines that have been initiated by these professional bodies in conjunction with the regulatory associations is been to try and then curb it at the point of dispensing. And as Cicely pointed out, this puts pressure on that pharmacist and that pharmacist-patient relationship. And it also poses lots of challenges in that the decision to dispense or not to dispense then sits at that pharmacy and with that pharmacist. So there's been other ways that agencies have tried to curb demand, and some of it is cross-border supply. So in Canada, British Columbia restricts pharmacists from exporting to non-Canadian citizens. You've also got quite a lot of surveillance in terms of tracing and tracking supply from manufacturer to wholesalers through to patient, and that's predominantly has been to kind of curb the counterfeit supply or ensuring that that supply is legitimate. But these restrictions put quite a burden on a pharmacist and presents quite a few challenges, as Cicely has pointed out. The second area that regulators have tried to address the supply or the demand of these products is to look at regulating compounding. Compounding also has many benefits to a patient. It allows you to provide patient-centered care and create personalized medicines for patients, especially those medicines that may not be commercially viable or available at the time, but it was never meant to be large-scale manufacturing service, or certainly perhaps not as complicated as some of these products are to manufacture. And so many of the jurisdictions in their legislation have caveats in compounding laws to ensure that it is for named patients. So it's actually compounding for an individual rather than mass supply of these products. So how have regulators tried to curb this? There's countries have sat at either ends of the spectrum and some in between. And so with the professional bodies coming on board and trying to actually have some standards and guidelines around it. And once again, looking at Canada, they haven't banned compounding, but they've got some specific compounding standards, which is quite unique in how it's presented, especially in terms of ensuring that the prescribers approve the supply of a compounded product. And so that's written approval so that they know that their patient is being provided a product that hasn't undergone any quality or safety review, and that the patient then also consents to the provision of this product. And so utilizing the pharmacist's expertise in the compounding, but ensuring that the prescriber has approved this. And it does blur lines between compounding and manufacture in the scale. So many of the regulations don't actually specify maximum quantities of compounding for a named patient. So, but I don't think it was ever intended to be large-scale manufacture, and this presents quite a problem. And of course, you can't then advertise it as similar to or an alternative to Oxempic. It's clearly not able to be presented that way. And most jurisdictions have that requirements to ensure that you're not misleading the patient. And the other extent where you've got Australia and the Therapeutic Goods Administration actually banning compounding of these products. And that's due to the patient safety concerns and the lack of review of these products, but also that biologically complex drug that requires specific manufacturing processes, especially to maintain stability and effectiveness, and that the compounded versions may not be able to replicate these processes, and that's why they have banned it. I mean, it does also raise questions of shelf life and the therapeutic effectiveness if they're compounded in that manner. And so most of the compounding, it was understood, was for off-label use. And so by banning these products that are compounding, it was also an attempt to try and curb the off-label use. It does have implications for other products, and it'll be interesting to see what is next in that, in terms of balancing still being able to provide patients with that personalized care, and also ensuring the safety and safety of these products. So the third element was looking at counterfeit medicines and how countries have tried to address this. It's certainly been quite rife in the UK, where you've got hospitalizations as a result of the use of counterfeit medicines. So in trying to actually ensure that these products, there's been quite a number of activities that regulatory agencies have done. One of them is tightening the screening procedures at the border, but also trying to identify and track and trace where the legitimate supply is, so that counterfeit products and other mechanisms for supplying these products are highlighted quite early on. It's been a difficult battle to try and stay on top of it, especially in terms of how some of these counterfeit products are promulgated, mainly through social media, and also through private chat groups and closed groups. So it's hard to try and find and curb those alternative channels of distribution. And so there's also been a concerted effort to educate our patients and making sure that they're purchasing these products from legitimate channels. There's also quite a lot of interaction, I understand, by Interpol and Pangea to try and share information, have a coordinated initiative in trying to find and ensure that these products are off the market. The last area, which has been the most problematic, is regulating the advertising. So most countries don't allow direct-to-consumer advertising of prescription medicines. I understand there's only 2 countries in the OECD that allow it, and one is the United States of America, and the other is New Zealand. However, given social media and that one like and that one share, it is easy for all those ads to go viral and across countries, informing patients. So it's very difficult then to try and curb the advertising of it or impose your regulations on these ads. And it's been quite tricky, and it's probably one of the most challenging, even though the regulators have been quite active in trying to get some of these ads off social media and ensuring that the social media platforms are aware of what they're doing. It is quite difficult. It only needs a short 30-second clip online for a day to reach millions of users. So hard to trace and detect, and it's hard to enforce those regulations. So in conclusion, I think that medicines shortages are here to stay. We're certainly going to see this on the rise. But a couple of things to note is looking at our regulations and whether they're fit for purpose, certainly in today's climate. And also I mean, Cicely highlighted the FIP statement of policy on medicines shortages and removing those unnecessary variability of regulatory processes. One jurisdiction's laws has an impact across the globe, so it's very difficult then to sit in isolation, and certainly the sharing of information and the transparent tracing helps to try and curb some of the issues we're saying. There's no geographical boundaries where these medicines and there's advertising and misinformation. So certainly a collaborative effort is what we need, and perhaps looking at it from how we've done with pharmacovigilance, that monitoring and the mandatory reporting and that sharing of information together certainly would help try and address some of the issues that we're seeing today. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Sanya. Again, another excellent talk. I'm sure you'll all agree. And just to say, we've now heard 3 compelling but different perspectives. So Betty made clear that the patient should be our priority. Patient-centered care needs to come first and foremost when we're faced with these ethical dilemmas. And remember, sometimes you have to have difficult conversations with patients, and good communication skills here will be key too. And then Cicely went on to raise how difficult it is to perhaps have to refuse patients Ozempic because of scarcity and rationing. How do you balance priorities on an individual patient level? Do you perhaps have prejudices influencing that decision? We may all have some. Then Sanya reminded us that we should all be aware of the regulatory framework within which we're working. She highlighted the real dangers associated with counterfeit medicines and the need for global collaboration and the need to ensure patient safety. So now it's, what do you all think? I'd like to hand you over now to our panel of speakers, whom I'm delighted to say will be joined by Dr. Didier Mulliam, Vice President of the Industrial Pharmacy Section of FIP and General Secretary of the African Pharmaceutical Forum. So you're most welcome, Didier, and thank you for joining us today. And the panel discussion will be facilitated by Dr. Jessica Pace. Jessica is an associate lecturer in the University of Sydney School of Pharmacy and a registered pharmacist with experience in both hospital and community pharmacy. So I'll pass over to you, Jessica.
Thanks so much, Maria, and thanks to everyone for your fantastic presentations. Sorry, Didier, did you want to say something to get us started, or?
Yes, you can start. Yeah.
Sorry, I wasn't sure if I cut you off. It looks like we have a few questions in the chat to start us off. So Jamil has posted that KPMG has an international reporting mechanism called Fair Call for whistleblowers for counterfeit or falsified products. Do any of the speakers have experience of the success or failure of this concept or similar concept in our jurisdictions?
Can you, it's to me, it's me to answer, or you want me to present my idea of the situation first? Which question, please? You want me to answer the question?
If you have an answer, Didier, otherwise, if there is anything else you'd like to tell us about the Ozempic pandemic and any ethical
I will
issues that arise?
To say my point. Okay. Then the Ozempic pandemic is, of course, a big problem of shortage. But as you know, the shortage is not only the Ozempic problem. It's a big problem globally with many other products. I am myself working on it in a study about drug shortage globally in relation with university. I'm the vice president of industry section, and then what we want to push in the pharmacy industry section is to push the sharing of knowledge. That means that to give opportunity to all the countries to have technology, we organize the good manufacturing practice, we organize the best supply chain to make accessibility for product to all the people in the world. And then the Ozempic problem is one of that problem. Then we know that there are many countries who never have Ozempic because it's not registered there. And we have some who have Ozempic, and then they don't have because I have lucky to be practiced in many areas also to deliver it in a community. As industrial, we can do it sometime in some countries. And then I know that when people come, sometimes they go and see medical doctor and ask to prescribe Ozempic and they don't have diabetes. It's why, of course, the industry gave a response. They make a product like Wegovy, which is open to other people. And then the obesity drug became a success, turned into supply challenge. It challenged also the problem of the diabetes. Then first, globally, we do experience a broad range of product shortage on a very diverse set of products. The reason varies: international, long and complex supply chain, price pressure, minimizing cost, short, very slim supply chain, and certainly on demand through tendering failed inspection. Obesity is, however, a special case. The product has shown to be more successful than anticipated. It's why there is a shortage. Most exiting, not just because of weight loss benefit, but also the side effect was not high. A large part has been related to finished good manufacturing capacity. Then there is why that company are building now big capacity in US and also in Europe now. I know there is some products, people ask me why they don't make it locally, because the process is difficult. I think the process, many countries like Australia has to make it, but the process is difficult, but it will come. And then a large part which take time to expand, but it's also a complex chain for components to have the raw material, because it's, it's a glucagon-like peptide. The technology is a DNA, RNA, and then a glucagon-like peptide agonist of GLP-1.
Sorry, Didier, it looks like Betty has a comment.
Yes, could I ask you a question, Didier? From
Yes.
an industry point of view, with
Yes.
Ozempic in shortage, and Wegovy is now being promoted as strongly as the Ozempic, and it is exactly the same product. It's semaglutide and it's 1 milligram, and it's the same gadget. Why is it 5 times the price of Ozempic, and it's promoted for obesity? So is it the price that obese people are to pay? What's the story? Do you think you can tell us?
Yes, I can. The reason on an industry company, I can bring you in the short story of any product, as you know. For any product, you have the research and development, which cost a lot. You have research and development, and after you go to the product. Product, what means product? That means a big factory to make that product with the level of quality of the product to be sure for the patient. You think about the patient to be sure for the quality of the medicine for a patient. And as you say, you have the regulatory affairs to license and give right to the product to go in the market. And now the pricing 4 or 5 times Wegovy compared to Ozempic, despite both containing the semaglutide, likely stem from difference in the approved used formulation and market positioning. But the Wegovy is approved specifically for weight management in people with obesity, and then the distribution is not exactly the same. The cost of the communication is not exactly the same. There are many other costs in that, because it is not in the same market. Additionally, I can say the higher price of Wegovy could reflect the fact that weight loss tend to be priced higher than the strong demand, particularly in market where obesity is prevalent. Additionally, with both medication, what we do our best to make industry reduce the price. You have to be sure that in our section where we speak with all the companies, we do our best for the accessibility for patients to put obesity like a disease, you understand? Because if you put only diabetes like a disease, if you put also obesity like a disease, it can make the positioning different and the reimbursement and make the price low. It's one possibility.
I think there needs to be an ethical review of the product.
Say distributor for this kind of product put that price. You understand? Yes.
It's inaccessible for many people, and obesity seems to be penalized. Penalized. With the new product, it's the same. It's exactly the same as Ozempic. How come there's a shortage of Ozempic then? Tell me how there is a shortage of Ozempic if Wegovy is readily available but 5 times the price. Doesn't make sense.
You are right. The fact is that the investment is done, the heavier investment is done by all the all the companies who produce that company now. They are making heavy investment, you know, for example, 5 billion in US by one, and another competitor do 6 billion, and in Europe, 16 billion investment by the company who are doing now the factory to give the production to all the world, and I am sure to reduce the price. Of course, you are right. It's not normal to have 5 times the price of the same quality of products. It's why
exactly.
The ethics have to be done. We are pharmacists. When we go out of the faculty of pharmacists, it's why in the industry we push that in all industry we have a pharmacist in the managing of the pharmaceutical industry, because we have we call that in France serment of Galien or French countries. Then when we graduate like pharmacists, we have to give to the patient the best for the disease and without making excess profit. Then it's our challenge also.
Didier, could you get them to watch this webinar, please?
Yes, I called this morning the company. They are watching.
Thank you. Good, thank you. Tell them to move a bit. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Didier, you've mentioned communication as well. So what, if any, changes to communication strategies from manufacturers would ensure that pharmacists have timely notice of shortages of medicines and ways that we can address these?
That is important. The communication depends of the regulatory, you know that, by the fact the communication of any drugs is supposed to be done for the practitioner, and you cannot communicate to people when it is reimbursed by the national security or the government. But when it is not, the advertising is different. Then you go again in what I say in the beginning, any product is related to patients, but the production need to go the step from production, price, distribution, and communication. The advertising have to be adapted to be sure that when there is a problem of shortage somewhere, we are developing some data management to know where is shortage. Then when shortage happens somewhere, it's possible to communicate and supply that place. It's why we are working on it to be sure accessibility for drug for all. Then to communicate good advertising to people to be sure to reduce the shortage.
Great, thank you so much.
You can only communicate during the Congress to practitioners when they are reimbursed, you cannot go on TV in many countries, but there are some countries where you can go in public communication, and other you cannot.
I think Cicely has a question or a comment.
No, to continue on that question that Jessica posed. So my role in the middle presentation was to keep myself in practitioner role. So if I am in the pharmacy on a Saturday morning and I have a patient arrive with a legitimate prescription for an ongoing therapy that is in short supply, then the system has already failed that patient, and the system has already failed me, the practitioner. So I find it interesting that your answer response, and it absolutely within expectations, as to what the communication will be when the shortage has already happened. The question is, how might there be timely advance notice of impending shortages of medicines? And I say that in the context of the way industries globally now use data analysis tools and AI and all of those things to analyze data in ways they could not do before. And to me, I'm not a technology expert, but I don't need to be to say that we ought to be able to predict shortages. And industry has the data long before the regulators would have to be able to do that prediction, put mitigation in place, etc., etc. So would you have anything to add in that context?
Okay, what I can add is that, of course, we work with data concerning drug shortage. That means many countries have the list of shortage, and also globally with industry. And then we can have data collecting by a company like IQVIA. I don't know if Ruben can share that data. I sent to him. Then in the data, we have, for example, the duration, less of 1 month, less of 2 months, less of 4 months. Then when you have a patient coming in your pharmacy, you can have information through your pharmaceutical society or through your distributor to know after 1 month it will be available, because maybe the factory is now coming from raw material coming from Asia. It will come from there, and then we know that after 1 month, after 2 weeks, after 3 weeks, we can communicate to patient the right date. And if it is too long concerning the patient need, because the disease don't stop, we have to give the best alternative to that patient to make sure he have the control of his disease. Then we have the data concerning the mostly unprotected product, the knock-on impact, the rarely innovative product, and the exact date of shortage. We know when the shortage will go down. We know that. Concerning Oxempic, of course, it's more hard there because the competitors are not many, of course. The competitors are not many, and the raw material is made by only one company, and then it's more hard, but we know the time, we have the date.
Thank you, Didier. I'll just go to the questions that have been posted in the Q&A box now. So any of the panelists, please feel free to jump in with these ones. So first question was that KPMG has an international reporting mechanism called Fair Call for whistleblowers for counterfeit or falsified products. Does anyone have experience of the success or failure of this concept or similar concepts in our jurisdictions, or any views on whether this would be a useful strategy in instances such as the Oxempic pandemic, where we are seeing a rise in counterfeit or falsified products?
Of course, the risk of counterfeit, I say it in the beginning, we know that when there is the drug shortage, there are counterfeit products, and then it's a risk. And then we are working on it, and then KPMG have some data, IQVIA have some data, and then it is one of the part of the challenge we have to be sure to predict and stop all the problem we can have related in that drug shortage, and stop also the counterfeit product.
Sanya,
Jess?
Cicely or Betty? Yeah.
I was going to say in Australia, there isn't this whistleblower, but we do use the social media and we do use TV. And I can tell you the power of that documentary that was done by the ABC was so powerful that the Australian government changed the legislation about compounding Ozempic. So I guess it's whistleblowing, but not to a particular body. But it works. Yes, it does. Sanya, sorry if you wanted to say something.
I just wanted to add to that. I think communication, which was spoken about early, and ensuring that the patients that need that information get it in real time. So, these products and the information is almost viral. Like, it happens so quickly, and to be able to identify counterfeit medicines and to ensure that those that are taking it are aware of the perils of it immediately is the difficulty. That we've got systems in place for pharmacovigilance that turns that information around quite quickly. You've got food recalls going on quite quickly. I'm not entirely convinced, looking at the data across the globe, that counterfeit medicines, the action is as quick as we might want it at this stage. And there's some really good work that has happened in Australia with that ABC program, and and publication, and making patients aware of the issues, but perhaps a little bit more would be helpful.
Yes, I would like to receive that TV program from Australia. I would like to receive it.
Would you like to see it?
Yes.
I've got the link in the in my slides.
Okay.
It's 4 corners.
Thank
the
you.
Ozempic, I think it's called the Oxempic Pandemic or something of that sort.
And what
It's a very powerful program, really powerful. And I also wanted to speak to Cicely's point about notification. In Australia, the industry is obliged legally to give notice if there's shortages pending, or they have notice. And if the government is notified or knows that the company is not telling everything, they have the right to fine the big pharma. They get fined. So that was a result of the Toronto summit of FIP, and it was it took a while, but it's now legislated. It has to happen. But with Ozempic, as Sanya is saying, it was so quick. Everything is so swift. Even the Wegovy coming onto the market to fill in the gap with the same product and the same look and the same gadget is really confounding the issue 100%. I think you're saying that the industry is making factories for the gadget, for the device, because semaglutide itself, the raw material, isn't in shortage. It's the device. So if they can get over that, I don't know, but they have to think of a much fairer way of accessing this medicine.
No, you agree. You say the right thing. When we have the hepatitis C problem during many years after we have the sofosbuvir coming in the market, the price was so high, nobody in Africa was able to have it.
Yeah.
And we have solutions, and then they save also Africans with hepatitis C. The Ozempic people want it everywhere in the world. Now it's a shortage, but with the investment done now by the industry, in the future, it will be good. What we want that is that the future come too soon, not far. Yes, we push
Hopefully.
to be sure they make it quickly, and we push that to be sure they share technology to permit other countries to have it as soon as possible.
That's good to know. Cicely.
Cicely?
Hi, Jessica. Thank you. Just a quick comment. Betty, you remind me to just clarify that, yes, that system is available in Europe as well, i.e. the system where there's an expectation that the manufacturer would notify the regulator, etc. I was rather trying to bring the focus to the point, or to bring spotlight the point that the focus is on shortages. If we get to that point, the system has failed. And it fails at the point of the pharmacist-patient interaction. And that's a failure, and just that we flag that. And I know you're agreeing with me.
Absolutely.
I think also that because we all come from the ethics advisory group and that concept that none of this is black and white, preparation for today, and Betty, particularly your ability to articulate and be up in arms about what you saw happening in Australia, allows us to stand back and say the right to dispense extemporaneously, which I would say is in the completely unlicensed medicines and I didn't deal with at all, is a responsibility that we need to talk about. And that while it is a right for most registered pharmacists, the ability to stand back and say, are there times when you should not exercise that right, is what you really spotlighted today. And I hope that is one of the takeaways from today, that we continue to discuss where our rights and abilities as registered pharmacists don't necessarily mean that providing a service is the right thing to do. And you know well that I hadn't realised that Australian situation, so I'm guessing there are a number of people on the call today for whom that's new. And it really was horrifying to think that colleagues, registered pharmacists, might have chosen to take that route.
Thanks, Cicely. I think I totally agree, and the swiftness with which everything happened also took us by surprise. We didn't know that people were manufacturing in pharmacy and sending them overseas as well, not just manufacturing, also sending them overseas. It's crazy. I mean, that's why we did this webinar. This is why, just to create the awareness and to make sure people are thinking before they do that kind of compounding.
Okay, we are ready to do action plan for shortage with you, with industry, with community section, other section. We can do some call of action for do awareness. Then we are sure to have some task force to follow up to be sure we make it will be against drug shortage, of course, including the Oxempic, but also others for the benefit of patients.
Okay.
I think there's another question on the chat, and Sanya, you may want to start us off with this one. So the question was about, in South Africa, the regulator has stated that anyone considering the use of compounded medicine providers should be aware that the medicines may contain salt forms of semaglutide, and those salt forms are not permissible as per the Medicines Act. So products containing the salts have not been reviewed for quality, safety, or efficacy. So is this a similar stance to what other regulators took in response to this situation?
Yeah, so thanks for that question. It's an interesting one. Most regulators aren't permitting the use of any active that hasn't been reviewed and isn't in that approved list, and these salt forms with sodium or acetate aren't approved. I think FDA, MHRA, all of them don't have them in their approved list. So that none of them would permit the compounding using products that are unapproved and haven't been reviewed.
I think Ruben can help us out with the chat box and the question Q&As after the webinar. So I just had another question. So we've spoken a bit about off-label prescribing. There's a lot of debate about ethics of off-label prescribing. I just was wondering if anyone wanted to comment on the ethical issues that arise from that, how they're nuanced. So is it that it's the same type of ethical issues for all off-label prescribing, or is it more or less ethically acceptable in different situations? So for example, we know off-label prescribing can range from just using a registered product for a different indication to what it's registered, but it could also be a completely new compounded product like we've been speaking about today. So how do those ethical considerations vary on that? Or is there a spectrum of off-label prescribing where the ethical considerations can vary?
I'll start this one. Just in terms of if it's unlicensed or unapproved, then especially in this, it's biologically a complex drug, and it's quite hard to emulate that in the pharmacy in what you're confined to. So I think the risk of that is quite high compared to, from a regulator's perspective, looking at something that is approved, but for an off-label or for an indication that's not approved, that is accepted practice or standard practice. So the risk associated with it, provided that you know the dose and the appropriate dose and there are guidelines around that, is probably less. And so that's why the target around regulations has been difficult to try and manage the demand or the shortage issue, because from a regulatory perspective, you're managing risk and maximizing benefit. And so your risk is at that unapproved, unregistered or compounding rather than off-label use.
Jessica? I'll talk to the ethical part of it. If you get an off-label prescription, what I think about is informed consent of the patient. Do they know that it's off-label? Do they know, or has the doctor just, in their wisdom, just written something? First of all, I'd have to make sure that I understand why the doctor has prescribed it off-label. I don't care how simple or how complex, whatever that medication is, if it's off-label, I find it my responsibility to make sure I understand and document what the reason was for that prescription, and make sure that the patient or the patient's carer actually is informed enough to make an informed decision. Have they been has it been explained? Has the doctor taken the time to get consent for it? Because I don't think it's fair to give an off-label product or prescription to someone who's blindly trusting the doctor and the pharmacist. I'm the gatekeeper, so I have to have some responsibility, and into the dispensing system, I would record it. So, I once was working in a hospital, and the doctor gave something very strange at the time. I think it was ranitidine for some kind of skin issue. And when I called the doctor immediately quoted the article from the Lancet. He just said, "This is why I prescribed it, blah, blah, blah." And I took that information to the mother of the child, etc., etc. So we have to make sure that there is informed consent around that. Cicely, what's your experience?
Yes, I would agree. Informed consent is certainly a factor. There are additional expectations in some countries, and I've experienced this, whereby if a medication is prescribed off-label, as you say, we refer to it as an exempt product, there's additionally my responsibility to make sure, to assure that the prescriber knows they're prescribing off-label, that they are prescribing other than to the indication and or the dose, etc., that is in the product authorization at a national or European level. So the informed consent piece is probably core to my role in dispensing and that interaction with the patient. But we certainly have this additional upstream, if you like, or interprofessional responsibility. Now, how do you do that in the community pharmacy setting can be very complex. It's relatively straightforward in the hospital setting where you're face-to-face interacting. So there are, and that's just simplistically, rather than pick a whole load of things, that's an additional responsibility to be sure of the basis from which the prescriber made the decision to choose that dose or that indication for the patient. I do reiterate, however, that, and I've worked in a few different jurisdictions, I've never worked somewhere where there is an obligation of a prescriber to include on the prescription the indication for which they're prescribing. I believe that's something we ought to continue to advocate for at a global level, because it makes it very difficult to really exercise our ability to make judgments for individual patients when we don't have access to others on the team. I hope that captures maybe some of what you're thinking, Betty.
Thank you, Cicely. Yes, perfect. Jess, have we run out of time?
It looks like we're just running out of time. Are there any closing thoughts anyone wanted to add before we hand back to Maria to wrap up?
Nothing from me. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, everyone. And Maria has our wrap up.
Honored to be invited to this panel. And then I hope we will stay in touch to continue the discussion and see how to do better in the ethics and the resolve that drug shortage problem.
Yeah, the connection is quite poor, but I think you're saying that you'd like us to keep in touch so we can work together.
Thank you.
And that would be fabulous. I'm sure, Betty, you'd be delighted. And all of us in the Ethics Advisory Group would be delighted to work with you.
Thank you.
Can I just, I'm very conscious that we have run over time. So I would just like to sincerely thank our three excellent speakers today, Betty, Cicely, and Sanya, for the really insightful and challenging views on the Ozempic pandemic. And I'm sure you all agree that they've given us lots to think about it. I'd also like to thank Didier for his expertise and the further perspective that you brought, Didier, to the panel discussion from that industrial perspective, and also to Jess for chairing the discussion. So just to remind everybody that our 83rd FIP World Congress will be in Copenhagen in Denmark next year, 31st of August to 3rd of September. So I hope to see you all there. And please do check out for all future FIP digital events. Thank you so much for attending today. And I hope you'll all agree it was a useful and informative session. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.